name's Jonathan Mirren. I'm with Valley Arts Mentors. We're a program that works to support the arts ecosystem in the Connecticut River Valley. And I'm also part of PT Theater Company, and I'm very pleased to have been working on Valley Arts Mentors with Holyoke Media and Scott McPherson in particular. So with that said, I'd like to welcome everybody to Marketing for Artists, which I know is a big issue for me, and I'm really looking forward to learning tonight. And with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Jason Montgomery, who will introduce the panelists and get us going. And just so no one forgets, we want to thank Mass Humanities, the Community Foundation of Western Mass, and the Mass Cultural Council for making this possible. Jason?
Hello, my name is Jason Montgomery. I am from both Attack Bear Press and 50 Arrow Gallery, and I have the honor tonight of moderating our conversation. I'm going to do it a little bit differently tonight so that it isn't just 5 minutes of me reading off bios. I'm going to ask that the panelists go ahead and introduce themselves, share a little bit about yourselves, and can we go ahead and start with to my direct, the audience cannot see who's to my direct right, but I'd like to welcome Mitch Anthony to go ahead and tell us a little about yourself.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, it's an honor to be here. My name is Mitch Anthony. I live in Greenfield. I have lived here. I've lived in the Valley since the 70s. I have a lovely story to tell, which I could regale all of you with you about tonight. But the short version is, when I came of age, being a hippie was still a career option, and I chose that. And what I meant by that was I wanted to work for peace, truth, and understanding. The weird thing is, if you had told me I was going to end up as a marketing expert, I would have said, you've got the wrong script. But 10 years into my journey, I was working with a tofu manufacturer, and someone had to do the marketing, and I picked up that mantle. Several years later, I was essentially running an in-house ad agency for that manufacturer, and I went to my boss, who's still a friend, and he said, yeah, why don't you take my company as your first client? And so my first clients were natural foods companies. I've run an agency, I've run a design firm. In the past 10 years, I have focused primarily on core brand identity. To me, your brand is your promise to those people you serve of how you help them. I have a parallel complementary definition of brand, and that is when someone within your target audience thinks of you, what do they think? That's the position you own in their mind. So question number one is that what you want them to think? And question number two is, what do you want them to think? Now you have 2 points on a map, and that begins the marketing process. So again, I'm very, very glad to be here. I'm very, very glad to meet my other panelists, and I'm really glad to help where in any way that I can.
Thank you so much, Mitch. That sounds incredibly interesting, and I hope we have some time tonight to really dig into not just your history and experience, but also I'm curious about everyone's philosophy. But with that, I would like introduce Michelle Falcón. Michelle, you are a wonderful human being, and can you tell us a little about yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Falcón Fontánez. I'm a multimedia storyteller. I specifically do work in photography and filmmaking. I was actually born and raised in Holyoke, Mass. And the reason why I went into storytelling was because I heard like a lot of like stereotypes. I'm a first generation Boricua. And growing up, I really heard a lot of like negative stereotypes surrounding people from my community. And so I got into storytelling to try to challenge those stereotypes. And then that just blossomed into going into undergrad and then my master's program into filmmaking. And now I am happy to say that I'm a full-time photographer and filmmaker. And I specifically work with nonprofits and small businesses and also artists. And one of the things that I really try to do with my clients is like work with them on like what specifically is their story and trying to highlight that and get into the essence of like their authentic self. versus trying to have people try to sell and like sound salesy. I just really think it's interesting and it's the best way to connect with people and have people actually want to work with you and buy your work or contract you for services.
Wonderful. And I'd love to hear more about the process of finding an authentic voice for your clients and finding an authentic voice for your own artwork and marketing, because I think that's what we're all here tonight. But with that, I would love to introduce Fungi Tichawanga, and I may have just butchered your last name, and if I did, I apologize. But I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Jason. Yes, it's Fungi Tichawanga. And I got into marketing when I was starting college, and at that time I didn't realize that's what was happening. I got into websites. I would spend lots of time in computer labs, just playing around with computers. And in those days, there was no WordPress, there was no Facebook, it was just pure HTML. And I started building websites. And I started a business that built websites for other businesses. And because I myself was very artistically leaning, if I can put it that way, I started doing a lot of work with artists and built a website that told the stories of artists, that shared pictures, images, video, and stories about artists. And one of the things I realized working with artists over a prolonged period of time was that you had these really talented people who were doing amazing work and were trying to build an audience for their work, trying to get it out there. And you would meet them on one day, meet them 3 years, 5 years later, and they were still basically in the same place. And it bothered me, and I started wondering, what is it? What is the disconnect? And one of the things I realized is that as artists, because when you're young and you're a writer, a painter, whatever it is, people come to you and say, "Oh, you're such an amazing writer, you're such an amazing painter, you're such an amazing designer, whatever it is." And so your work finds an audience naturally. And so I think we come into art thinking, oh, well, if the work is good, it will find an audience. And yet, if you think about the biggest, brands, arts and culture brands. So think of, for instance, Marvel, right? Marvel has tens of thousands, hundreds, millions of fans around the world, right? But when they put out a movie, $200 million marketing budget, even though they've got fans, they know that they're competing for people's attention. And so as artists, no one ever teaches us that. But yeah, your work may be good, but if you want to find your audience, you have to do the work. So you work on your art, but then you also have to work for your art to get it to the people you want to reach. And so that's how I got into working with building websites for artists, digital marketing for artists and cultural organizations, and I also work with businesses. And so now I run a digital marketing agency based in Amherst, and it's called Artist Dynamics.
Fascinating. And I think you touched right on what the first question was going to be, which is, how important it is to build a brand, a personal brand for an artist, and what steps can artists take to establish that brand identity? Because I think that's the question that all of us artists out in the world are asking. So I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on that matter. And anyone can take it away.
I'm glad to go first on that if no one else wants to. I'm here because I met Jonathan several years ago, and Jonathan took one of my own workshops that I call DIY Brand Camp, how to discover your own brand. And I developed that 10 or 15 years ago. And when I did, I realized I was taking decades of experience and distilling it into a 2-day workshop. And I had to ask myself, well, where do we start? And I recognized that the first and most fundamental question that many of us don't take the time to answer is with whom am I speaking? And Fungi, I think you spoke directly to this. There are people who relate and resonate with your work. Who are they? And if you can begin by understanding who they are, and what their characteristics are, you can begin to build the process of resonance. One of my own principles in my work is recognizing that in the best of all worlds, our audience is looking for us as hard as we're looking for them. And if we can speak in a tone of voice and a language that is relevant to them and only to them, we're not speaking to everyone, we're speaking to them, we will get resonance. So my suggested first step, and I think, Jonathan, you've heard me describe this process, is I call it finding your Sally. And I call it that exercise because when I first sat down and said, well, who is my ideal client? I thought of a woman named Sally Meixel. She's a real person. At the time, she was the head of school at a local private independent school. As I got to know her, I recognized how much I respected her. And then I began to look at, well, what are the characteristics that I respect? And I thought, well, she's worldly, she's sophisticated, she's open-minded. She's very, very community-minded. She's not egotistical. She's a leader in ways that she empowers people. She gives them rope. She allows them to make mistakes. And I realized in doing that, I'm not talking to everyone. I'm talking to a very, very specific open-minded person. So I began to think about addressing all of my communications, whether it be a blog post or whether it be a tweet or whether it be a website posting, specifically to Sally. I would ask, would Sally understand this? Now, what's very interesting is after I did that exercise, she retired from that school. I told her that, Sally, I've named a process after you because we had become friends. Several years later, she called me and she was now working with a consulting company. And she said, Mitch, I need you again. And I need you because you understand me. And so I could talk again for a long time, but I'll start this discussion by saying, for me, step one is understanding who is a really best fit client member, audience member, and think small. The most effective way to reach more people is to speak to fewer in a more direct voice than it is to more in a more diffuse voice.
Fascinating. And I know that for those who aren't aware, I also am an artist and a writer. Oftentimes my audience is not a consideration right up front when I'm actually doing my work. And to hear how that should be a larger part of my marketing efforts really makes me reconsider, where audience is in my process. But I'd love to hear from everyone else as well.
Well, following up on that, Jason, I do think that part is important, but I think it has to be kind of like a step or like a category within that. Because the very first thing that I like to do when I work with clients is having them start from like the beginning and like what made them actually want to go into art or their specific medium in the first place. And even backing up further then is just like talking about like their upbringing, and because a lot of times that also plays a role in terms of like the type of art that you create as well, specifically for people of color too. And the reason why I like to bring that up too is because there's oftentimes like in media, even though I know that like even with social media nowadays being like very present like in our lives, I do feel like there's still like some barriers for people of color. And so like I like to kind of like talk with them and just like bring that up in the very first like instance of like just sitting down and talking about through their story. And the reason for that is just because I think that a lot of people can resonate with specific challenges that people have like in the beginning of their career or upbringing, and that in itself will have people like gravitate towards you because of like they can relate even if they're not even if they're not like Boricua or Colombian, they might still relate to like, oh yeah, I actually went through that, or my aunt went through that, or my brother went through that. And just based off of like that, building that foundation and that connection, that will also help build like your following in that sense, because people want to, at the end of the day, people want to see you win. And just also, I think that being very clear about like your beginning can also play a role in terms of like where do you want to go like in the future, if that makes sense. And the type of art that you want to focus on and want to continue creating.
That is so fascinating. And I'd love to come back to this idea, particularly of individuals of color and how that might change our marketing strategy. But I'd love to hear your take on the first question, though, Fungi.
Yeah, when you talk about branding, I was reading something interesting recently, and it was talking about how when you look at people on social media who represent certain brands, the individual has a bigger following than the business, right? So Bill Gates has way more followers than Microsoft. Elon Musk, way more time more followers than Tesla. Beyonce, more followers than Sony BMG, because the most powerful brand is the personal brand, right? People want to follow people. And I've seen this operate in my own experience, where I will sign up for a newsletter, an email newsletter, and I'm getting email from someone thinking, oh, why do they keep sending me so much email, right? And then I sign up for another newsletter, and this person is emailing me. It could be weekly, it could be every 2 days. And I'm like, oh, yes, I can't wait to read this. And because I've made the connection. And this ties in with what Mitch was talking about, which there are people looking for you. And the people who want to connect with you, who you are, what you are doing. And so definitely I agree with the idea of building a personal brand. And these days it's about how the content you put out on social media, how you find your audience on the different platforms that are out there. And so it's a very big part of it. And going back to your point about where do you put the audience in the process of creating your art, I would say there are some. So for instance, when you look at writers, there are some writers who will say, okay, what's selling right now, right? And I want to write a ton of that. That's one way of doing it, a very commercial way of doing it. Then there's some writers who will be like, okay, this is what I'm feeling. I'm going to write that, and then think about the audience once it's done. And it's up to you as an artist, what's important for you, right? Is it just, I just want to churn out a ton of art and really sell thousands of pieces or books because that's what's selling? Or I'm creating work that means something to me, and I will figure out how to find the audience that's looking for this, and I will do as much work on that part of the process as I am with creating the work. So two different approaches. Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I picked up on that, Jason, when you said, I never think about my audience when I'm creating. And then you went on to say, or marketing to them. And to the point that was just made, they're very, very different processes. Creation is one thing, that's you and yourself. Marketing yourself is different. Now you're reaching out to another person. Now you're engaging with another person. But I totally agree. I would hope that we would never encourage anyone to create to an audience. You create something that's passionate, you're passionate about. Then you find the audience who shares the passion. An artist and a writer who I suspect a lot of you are familiar with, Austin Kleon, who wrote a book 10 years ago. He wrote a book called Steal Like an Artist. And the principle of the book, it's about creativity and the creative process. And the title comes from, he acknowledges that none of us can be completely original. We're all mixing and matching. We're all creating hip hop. We're all making something new out of something old. But I follow him. To your point, one guy, I look forward to his newsletter every Friday morning at 10 o'clock. And And I always open it and I read it cover to cover because his words, his thinking, his attitude resonates with me. And someone once asked him, to the point that we're all making, why don't you write a blog post on self-promotion? And he said, here's my blog post about self-promotion. One sentence. Write something that you yourself would want to read.
That is really interesting. And sorry, I had a moment of technical difficulties if everyone was wondering why I was frozen looking so intently. But I love this phrase, people want to follow people, because often as a gallerist, my other gig is running 50 Arrow Gallery. What I see on social media, and I'd love to talk a little bit about social media, is a preference towards showing the work, but not necessarily the person behind the work. And I'd love to hear about how you would suggest balancing that for individuals so that they can show themselves, but also to show a lot of their own work. If that question made sense.
Yeah, it does. And it's something that comes up a lot when you're working with artists, because most artists that I've worked with who are not performing artists don't want to be the front and center. They want the work to be out there, right? If you're a writer, you want the book to speak for itself. Yeah, if you are a fashion designer, whatever it is. And on social media, the big push over the last few years has been, you are the voice of your brand, of your business. You need to be out there. But now there's a new trend of faceless reels, faceless social media posts, which is doing really well. So people who are like, yeah, I really don't want to do this. I really don't want to have my face, my voice out there. And you figure out a strategy where you never put your face out there, and it's possible to build an audience that way.
Who is Banksy?
Yeah. Yeah, good point.
I think it also depends on what you feel comfortable in, right? Or doing. And I know that sounds super simple, but I think it's just because there's so many like different trends. And I remember, I mean, TikTok now is obviously a little bit different. There's still obviously the content of like people dancing and stuff like that. But I think that there's still like it has expanded so much. Whereas like in the beginning, I think a lot of people were trying like forcing themselves to like do those trends of like doing those dances just to keep up, but it just didn't feel like it didn't feel aligned with who they were. And you can see that, like the camera picks up on that. The camera picks up whether it's like with photos or video, like you can see if it actually aligns with you, if it's authentic to you. So I think that's like kind of like, again, it's super simple, but I think going back to like that balance of what you're asking, Jason, it really depends on like if it resonates with you. If the content that you're creating is not resonating with you, if it makes you feel uncomfortable, then I don't think that you should necessarily create it in that sense. And there is a difference between feeling a little self-conscious, and a little bit with self-doubt, because that is like a real thing. But I do think that at the end of the day, you have to create work that you feel as a person that you resonate with, that it stands, that you can stand on with that, if that makes sense.
And that makes a lot of sense. Authenticity often is a word that's thrown around in art when we start talking about the work itself, but also thinking of that step beyond it and saying like, what is authentic to me as an artist is another question that I know personally as an artist I don't often ask when I think about my own marketing. I'm so concerned with, what can I actually just get out there? What content can I generate? And that should be good enough. But it is really compelling to hear that, no, I should be thinking about this as being an authentic. Sorry, if our attendants have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat, by the way. Sorry, there's the voice from beyond, Jonathan and Scott, who are giving us messages. But One of the things that I want to ask, because I know practically, there are a lot of people, and we've talked about social media, who are wondering, like, where should I be focusing my effort? Like, there's so many platforms. What should I be focusing on? And maybe someone can speak to that. I know for me, I look at TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, all of these things, and I'm like, oh my God, where do I put my energy? I only have so much.
Yeah. Well, I can start on that one. I'd say firstly, you don't want to be on every platform because it's too much work even managing one platform effectively and succeeding on it. So my recommendation is always have one main platform which is where you're going to build your audience, where you're going to think about your strategy. Then on the other platforms, you can just have a presence. So for instance, if you say, okay, I'm going to be on Instagram, that's going to be my main platform. You don't want to be absent when someone goes on Facebook and looks for you, right? So you just want to have a presence and have a page. And if you want to automate posts from your main platform to that platform, fine. But you know that this one platform is my main platform. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't matter whether you pick Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, right? So right now, TikTok and Instagram, biggest ones, right? Easiest ones to grow, to get reach, to grow your following. So I'd recommend one of those. But I would say pick one and kill the FOMO, right? And just focus on that one platform.
Yes, and for anyone who doesn't know, FOMO means fear of missing out, which I think we all experience when we're artists and we see a new platform launch and we're like, oh my gosh, am I missing an audience by not being on TikTok 3 times a day? Or am I missing an audience by not being on Facebook 4 times a day? But I'd love to hear other people's opinions on social media as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends also on like the region that you're trying to tap into too, because I feel like in Western Mass, like Facebook, yeah, even though in some parts of like the country may or even the world may seem like, oh, it's not something that is used anymore, but in Western, like in parts like in like smaller communities, even like in Latin America, they're still heavily using Facebook. So it really depends on like, again, like going back to what Mitch was talking about, like who's your audience and where are they spending their time on? Because it might, at the end of the day, it might also be Facebook. And then also, I know we haven't touched on this yet, but there's the reason why I still use Facebook is because I'm a part of like different like groups as well, like artist groups. And you want to tap into like also your network. And so like I just feel like, again, like different platforms have different tools that you can use to your advantage as well.
I'd like to pick up on something Michelle just said, and it comes back to something that was said earlier. At the end of the day, we're building relationships, and one of the things that I feel has happened in the past 15 years is this fear of missing out, this expectation that everyone should suddenly be a master in using social media. Well, wait. My job number one is to be an artist. My job number one is not to be a marketer. My job number one is to create, then to connect with an audience. And connecting with an audience does not necessarily mean social. To your point, Michelle, my audience may not be on any social platform. And why am I worrying about expanding my audience when my core audience isn't there at all? But I want to come back to something that was said earlier. At the end of the day, we're building relationships. And one of the things that I coach solopreneurs, and an artist is a solopreneur. It's an entrepreneurial activity, but we're doing it as a solo artist. We're not building an organization. Marketing an organization is different than marketing an individual person. Well, an individual person has a network, to the point you just made, Michelle. And I often point out, you know what? You don't need a Facebook post. You don't need a website to reach out to your own individual audience. If you've created something that you're very proud of and you'd like to share it, share it by email with 10 people, 5 people, and just say, if you like this, would you pass it on? You know, it can start very, very organically, and it can start very, very slowly. Ultimately, we are talking about building a network, but it's a network of people who care about you and they care about each other ultimately. So while I do support, um, you know, I personally haven't participated in social media since um, the evil one bought Twitter. You know, once it became X, I was like, fuck it, I'm out of here. I do not want to participate in this attitude. And I quit. I had 4,000 followers, you know, I let them go. And did it matter to me? No. I actually put my own personal effort into a weekly newsletter following Austin Kleon's advice. I share things that are of interest to me. And you know what? Every single week, someone writes back to me with a very personal one-on-one letter response. And I build a very, very small, but very, very powerful network in that way. It's taken me years to do it, by the way. It's not an overnight success, but it's something that I enjoy. And it's something that I know my audience enjoys because they reply. Someone who I hadn't heard from, he was a client 5 years ago. Every so often he replies about the letter. And this week he just said, you know, I always appreciate your quirky personality. And I was like, what's that worth? That this guy who hired me 5 years ago, who knows who was he going to refer me to? You know, he recognizes my intelligence and my quirkiness, but it's a unique personality relationship.
That's fascinating, and it touches on a question that we did just get from the audience, and that is, what are things that you do personally to successfully reach your audience? And I'd love to hear everyone. Mitch, you wonderfully led us into that question, so thank you so much.
So for me, newsletters definitely work really well. And earlier on, I was talking about TikTok and Instagram, but for my business, I found LinkedIn works so much better. Right? Like there was a time when I was posting every single day on Instagram, and I can get the same result by posting once a week on LinkedIn, even once every 2 weeks, right? So it's, going back to what Michelle said, it differs from business to business and person to person.
For me, I'll just expand on this too, is honestly, I think it's because it depends on like the stage of where you're at in your business and like where you're pivoting. And so I'm in a pivot type of moment. So for me, what I've been focusing on is really tapping into community and specifically trying to find like online community. And that has led me into like different groups, not just on Facebook, not just on LinkedIn, but also just being invited to like different like specific groups. Like I'm in a brown girl doc mafia group that is like all across. It's dope. It's all across the US. And then I'm also part of like Women in Film New England as well. So through there, it's just like we're promoting like our projects, but then a lot of times also people have they post like different roles that they want to collaborate with people specifically on that group of. And also like it helps build community because if someone has like a specific question too, like everyone's like super supportive, just like, oh yeah, this happened to me too, and then here's my advice. So again, to me, it's I guess it depends on the season that you're in, and right now I'm in the season of like trying to find a different type of community or just building like networks like across the US.
Interesting, and I appreciate you talking about the idea of season and where you're at in your kind of artistic journey, because I know there are people out there who are saying, hey, I'm just starting out, I don't know how to find an audience. Can you give some advice to that guy who maybe has just put together their own comic book and they really don't know who to reach out to?
Yeah, there are a few off the beaten track platforms that do really well because you find really avid followers of different things, different art forms, different types of hobbies. So Reddit is one where you have people who have groups where they're talking about a particular issue and going really deep into it, and you'll find people discussing all sorts of things. Quora, Michelle mentioned Facebook groups. There's so many Facebook groups that are really active. So places like that are really good as a starting point because you know you're speaking to people who are interested in what you have to say.
I would also say, I know technically you're not supposed to be like comparing yourself to others, but I don't necessarily say it in that way. I just say more so like doing your research on like the specific medium that you're in and like what's working for people in that medium. Because you might find that they're doing something that you really love and that you want to also replicate in your own style, or you also might find that something they're like, yeah, I don't really want to like produce content in that way. And also that might get you closer in terms of like the content that you do want to produce. And again, I will always advocate for like trying to tap into the community of people in your network that you have around you. If you can find someone that is specifically in that medium, even if it's like one or two people to kind of like brainstorm some ideas together, I think that should be one of the very first steps as well. Just to kind of get like one-on-one advice from their own journey and their own process.
Awesome. And we have another question from the audience. This one comes from Kenneth Harris. Kenneth asks, would a professional website benefit email marketing long-term? If so, is a blog necessary? Can that get in the way of creativity?
So would a professional website benefit email marketing long term?
Yes.
Yeah. I think when you're thinking about online marketing, it's good to have your what I call your online headquarters, where ultimately you want people to end up. So if you're an artist and you've got samples of your work online, or a gallery, an online gallery where people can buy your work or book you to speak or whatever it is, you want people to end up on that page or on that platform. And usually it's your personal website, right? And the beauty about having a professional website is you can be on social media and say you're on TikTok and it's a hot thing. A few years from now, it could be something else, right? Or it could shut down. But when you build your personal website, your mailing list, those are things that you own, right? And you can move hosts, you can host it somewhere else, but you always have it. So definitely, if there are people who run successful mail newsletters without ever having a website, like using platforms like Substack and Beehive, you can do that. But I always think it's a good idea to have your online headquarters where you say that this is where ultimately I want you to end up and interact with my products, buy from me, connect with me. So definitely, I'd recommend having a website. But it's not one of the things that people get hung up on is, oh, I don't have a website yet, so I cannot start my online marketing journey, or it's going to take so long, or it's going to be so expensive. It's not a prerequisite, right? We've heard of all these different platforms right now. There are people who do really well online and only have an Instagram account or TikTok account or Facebook. But ultimately, I think the goal should be to have a platform that's yours, that you own, and a website and a mailing list are two of the best ones that you can have.
I'd like to hold up something that you just said, Fungi, which I think is really, really essential. To me, the gold is your mailing list. And the more current and the more connected that list is, I would much rather see a list of 75 people who you personally know something about than 750 people you've never met and know nothing about. And then you can grow that 750 to 150, and you can grow that 150 to 300, but you do it person by person, and you do it very, very slowly. To the question being asked, I love your your metaphor of online headquarters. It's a home base where you always know people can find you, and they'll always find a message that you have crafted. It's not someone else's language about you. It's your own language. I do a lot of client work for organizations, and we in turn do a lot of paid social advertising on LinkedIn, Google AdWords, etc. We never run an ad if there's not a coordinated landing page to go to. So whatever promise is made by the ad, when I land on that landing page, here is an expanded version of it. In the best of all worlds, that landing page is also attached to a website. And one of the measures of success that we look at in terms of year-to-year growth of a marketing program is traffic to the website and engagement with the website. How long are people spending there? How many pages are they reading? If we see people spending 3 and 4 minutes and reading 2 or 3 pages, we consider that. We now want to know something about them, and we really consider them a qualified lead.
I would just also like to say with the email marketing, even the famous people that we follow, a lot of times even the famous artists that we follow, they also have they also use email marketing to sell their merch, concert tickets, just also secret freebies or things of that nature that they want their top fans to know about. So I think there's a way to also just tap into that, because there was a second part of the question of just, can that get in the way of creativity? And I think that there's actually numerous ways that you can, or creative ways that you can expand on your blog or your newsletter. But it's also important to note that it's also another step, and then it's another task that you have to take on as a solopreneur if you're doing this on your own. And I would just say, just doing things little by little. There's also tools a lot of tools that you can use to your advantage to help you create graphics or just to automate things. So you can use that. It's just another department that you would have to spend time to actually create the content. And again, it doesn't have to necessarily be a newsletter that you do on a weekly basis. It could just be something that you do on a monthly or every quarter type of thing.
Interesting. And I appreciate that. If there are some tools that you would recommend, particularly to folks who maybe are novice, I'd love to hear some of those tools.
For mailing lists, websites?
Yeah, mailing lists particularly.
So I mentioned Substack earlier on, substack.com. Then there's Beehive, which is BEEHIIV. And on both those, you can start a mailing list for free, an e-newsletter and a mailing list at no cost. Then MailChimp, which a lot of people are familiar with. You can build, I think it's up to 500 people before you need to pay for it.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. I use MailChimp. I've used it for years. And I actually have 750 subscribers, and I've never paid a penny. I think it's 1,000 for free.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's quite robust. It's got a lot of analytics, and it's quite robust. I also would like to recommend website is something that I find really holds people back. And I noticed that the question was posed, a professional website, i.e., do you need a professional's assistant? I sell this for a living, and I would say, sure, when you can afford it, it'd be great to hire a professional. However, don't let that get in your way. Squarespace is designed for visual art. It's designed for artists, and it's beautiful. And there's a short learning curve, but it's very, very easy to make a beautiful portfolio website on Squarespace for a very small amount of money. It's got the disadvantage that you're now borrowing their platform, but for a beginner, actually, I put a number of client websites on Squarespace. My own website is on Squarespace. It works quite well.
If there's any photographers or filmmakers, I would recommend Pixie Set, because it has I love, super recommend. My website's on there. My client gallery's on there. I create invoice through there, like quotes through there. So everything is like seamless. It's all in one like project management system, which I love.
Awesome. Thank you all. I love the practical. So hearing actually some suggestions is amazing. We have another question from the audience. This comes from Kali Hernandez. They ask, my audience is a melting pot and very diverse. Do you have any advice on how to narrow down my core audience?
Because I was the one to suggest that you get as small as you can, let me answer that. Ideally, all of our audiences are very diverse. But what I would look for is psychographic characteristics. Are they politically aligned? Are they aligned by age? Are they aligned by interest? Are they aligned by attitude? One of my definitions of success is I'm looking for someone who's very open-minded. And I'm looking for someone who is very flexible, and I'm looking for someone who's very willing to think outside the box. That covers a whole lot of demographic characteristics, age, education, income. However, I've turned clients down because I realized I turned a client down recently because he told me he didn't let his kid eat in his car. I'm like, you know what? That's not the kind of person I want to work with. Sorry.
I guess you would not want to work with the kids are not allowed to eat in the car.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. The other thing that you can do is segmentation, which has become very easy with modern platforms like MailChimp, which we've spoken about, where say you send a weekly email and you realize that 80% of your audience only interact with a certain type of email and not other emails. You just segment it by tagging or creating different audiences. So when you send your emails, you know you're sending information to people who want to read it, right? And that way you're speaking to people and you don't lose some of your audience if you want to keep them.
Jason, I'd like to add something to the conversation that hasn't come up specifically, but I think it's inherent in everything we're talking about. At the end of the day, we're talking about establishing relationships with our audience. I really try my best to not assume, just to assume the opposite of a selling attitude. I don't have anything to sell. If I make my audience small enough and real enough, I have something to offer them, and they're looking for it and they want it and they need it. So with that comes a spirit of generosity. What can I give them? How can I help them? And again, I come back to my own definition of brand. Your brand is your promise to those you serve of how you help them. It's not about you, it's about them. And it's about you realizing their own personal visions. So generosity plays into this. And if we come back to, Michelle, you talked about people of influence on social. If I find someone that I find of value on social, I said I don't post on social, but I obviously learn on social. But if I were posting, what I would want to be doing is cross-posting and being generous. Like, look what I learned from so-and-so. And if I'm generous and I'm sharing, it's much easier that my ideas are going to get shared also, and my attitude is going to get shared also. So, one of the things about this culture that I find so frustrating, one of the many, is that art has become a commodity. And yet, if we fall to that low level of just trying to sell versus let me contribute something to the larger conversation, the larger human growth opportunity, it's a spiritual difference, and it affects how we act, and it affects how we receive.
I think you're tapping. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I think you're also like tapping into the fact that we also want to attract like our ideal clients too, right? And we don't want to be so desperate just to like sell and collaborate with anyone, just because then that also might turn into like having like a nightmare client too. And you don't want that. And I can tell you personally that you don't want that. Just because the project gets like drained, it just gets prolonged and prolonged and prolonged. And so on both ends, I think it is like this thing of like collaboration, like how can we work together? Like how are we both benefiting from each other in that sense?
And you excuse me if I'm off base, but I've heard the term community come up overtly, but I've also kind of heard this idea of marketing as community making. How do you all feel about that role and asking people to step into that role of making their own community?
I think it's a great way of approaching it. I'm just this morning, I heard someone talking about we should stop looking at followers as followers, but as collaborators. Because to Mitch's point, if your audience values what you are giving them and respect you and you respect them back, they will give you feedback that helps you develop your art, build better things. So one of the things that we're seeing right now with so much AI content online is people are starting to value person-to-person interaction even more. Because when I'm reading a blog post and I have no idea if a machine wrote this or a human wrote this, I want to speak to the person who knows, so I have that connection. So I'm a big fan of community and thinking about how do I find, as Seth Godin, I think, said, my tribe, right? And the people who love what I do, who are interested in what I'm interested in, and how do we build something together?
It's a really great point, and I think that more artists do need to hear that and hear that they are valued as an individual for their own voice, but also that it benefits them to talk and to step into the limelight, which I guess brings us around to the big question of self-promotion and how we should feel as artists about self-promotion, because there definitely is, I think, this bias against self-promoting. And how would you recommend we go about either overcoming that bias, dealing with that bias, or even just ignoring it altogether?
I mean, I would say that it's still like a process. It's a journey. Like I still struggle with it. There's still some platforms that I struggle with like promoting myself, but I think that it's really just coming to terms with the fact like that I know this is gonna sound very hippie, but it is what it is. I think it's just like that our society needs artists. Like we are super essential to to communities. We create change in communities, we inspire people, and we are just as important as teachers, as doctors, and just owning that and like standing in that power that your art is needed in this world. And that's like the very first thing that you need to do. Um, and then also just start with like baby steps. Start with like just even if it's like promoting yourself um uh, in your network of like in your friends, in like connecting with like previous coworkers, or just like creating one reel and just starting to like build on like having like different goals throughout like the weeks and the months and building them out and holding yourself accountable, I think also goes like a long way. Um, and just being more just being more prepared, I think too, of like using the tools to like get yourself like more organized, just so that way you feel more confident and better equipped as you go along. But honestly, the simple way of doing that is just doing it. Like you have to start somewhere and just it's okay if you're experimenting and you don't have to be perfect when you start.
Yeah. There's a writer that I'm working with who's just launched a book, and I recommended that they get some photos taken as part of their promotional material. And so this photo shoot got done, and they had these photos, and they were not posting them. So I say to him, what's happening? I don't see you posting the photos. And so we're on a Zoom call, and says, I just feel so self-conscious. It feels like I'm showing off, and I just cannot. I'm struggling with it. And I say to him, that's your story, right? Talk about that. Talk about how for years you haven't had a photo shoot because you don't want to be seen as showing off or being forward or whatever. And then share the photo and say, I finally got it done. And so that speaks to this whole idea of stop promoting and start sharing. Some of the most successful creators online just share their behind the scenes. This is what I'm doing today. This is what I'm working on. And they never sell anything, but they build audiences that start asking, where can I buy your stuff? So if the idea of promoting really, really irks you, think about just sharing. Because I don't remember who it is who say this, that people need artists, right? From an emotional, spiritual level, people need to connect with artists, with the whole idea of creating something from a very pure, it just rose up inside me and I wanted to do it sort of standpoint. And so when you start sharing your work, you'll find people who are like, oh yeah, this is what I was looking for.
And I love that phrase. And so I just want to repeat it, that stop promoting and start sharing, because it's such a shift on how we think about it. I know personally as an artist and then as an arts business owner, I'm constantly thinking, how do I promote? How do I promote? How do I promote this event? How do I promote this gallery opening? But how do I share the story of what we're doing is such a wonderful message, because we all want to share as artists. If you're an artist like me, you're very self-centered and believe that everything you have to say is important. I love the idea. I love that idea. But it does bring up a practical question for a lot of artists, and that's, can you give us some efficient ways to kind of balance our time between marketing and actually doing the creative work?
I would say very simple is setting up time blocks. That's what has saved me. Because if not, then I can be like spending like hours and hours on marketing in itself, and then my work doesn't get created. So it's just like having like a space of like, maybe it's every Tuesday afternoon for maybe an hour and a half. I'm gonna start creating content using Canva, and just being dedicated that that's my specific time block. I will not book anything unless it's like an emergency or it's like a very special project. I will not book anything within that time block. But then also giving myself the space of being like, I have to create this within this time, and that's it. Like, even if it's not perfect, I'm still going to just let it go. I'm done with the task, because if not, then that's taking away from other important tasks. And I think like Mitch said, it's like at the end of the day, we need to be focused on producing like our work.
You're both just, I'm resonating with what you're both saying so much. I love the idea of sharing versus selling. And then the discipline of putting it in a block. I'm working with an artist, a cello teacher. He's quite accomplished. All of his students are very, very accomplished. And what he is helping them realize is that they're all classically trained, and he's helping them move beyond the confines of classical music to begin to learn to improvise like a jazz musician. And he sees practice as a yogic practice. He sees an opportunity when he is practicing his instrument. It's an opportunity to come in touch with himself and notice where he's at. And when you were talking about that, Michelle, I was thinking, I once had a physical trainer in a gym, and she said, don't think of this as an obligation. Think of it as your time. And when you were talking about isolating time and saying, okay, Tuesday afternoons for 90 minutes, I'm going to work on storytelling or sharing. And treat it like a practice, treat it like an opportunity to get in touch with your own self. Notice what's coming up, notice your resistance. and maybe even talk about it. I love your idea of saying, talk about the fear. That's just brilliant. We were talking earlier about sharing your work as you go. That's going to be a specific one-on-one decision. But I recently was reading about an artist who he called it working with the garage door open. Who's coming by and say, oh, look at what I'm working on. It's just necessarily just leaving the door open. So this is.
Yeah, I'd also like to add what I'm furiously taking notes as the other speakers share, because it's so interesting. But I just wanted to share some tools about to help with efficiency. Someone asked, how do you make the process more efficient? So Michelle's touched on batch creation of content, where instead of waking up each day and saying, oh, what am I posting today? You create it all at once, every week or per month. And a good way to think about this is if you start with, okay, I want to post once a week this month. I just sit down and create 4 posts. Then I'm done for the month, right? I've got my post. And it's obviously, I'm simplifying it a lot, but then you think, okay, if I wanted to do 2, I'm just going to do 8. And obviously, there'll be some posts that you want to do spontaneously, but you know that you've covered your bases, that your foundation is in place. Then there are tools that you can use. So say you create videos. There are tools like Get Munch, right, which basically will go to your, you can give it a YouTube URL, or upload a video, and cut it up into reels based on what it thinks are the most, quotable parts of it, right? And it just does that automatically. There's repurpose.io, which can repurpose content for different platforms. Then there's a really cool tool called Answer the Public, because one of the things that people struggle with is, what do I post? Right? Answer the Public, you put in a topic, so it could be, books or how to paint or whatever it is, and it gives you a list of questions people are asking right now on Google and on different platforms related to that topic. So you've got a place to start by just answering those questions when you're thinking about your content.
And that was Answer the Public?
Yeah, answerthepublic.com.
Yeah, that's great.
I guess that is a nice segue into this idea of what tools do you personally use in your practice. We've talked about MailChimp. We've talked about Canva. If someone would like to explain what Canva is, just for the technically unsavvy, I'd love if we could take a second to do that. Excuse me.
I'm a huge fan of Canva. I think it started out as being just something that's like an easy, friendly tool to create like graphics. If you're not a graphic designer, it has expanded. Like there is, I think it also is doing like scheduling directly on like social media, but that's what I primarily use it on. Even though I do use Premiere, Adobe Premiere, Adobe Lightroom, and also Photoshop. Canva is like the way to go, because they have like a huge variety of templates for social media posts, for reels. They also have free content or like images, videos that you can use for your own social media reels or content. They also, I know that they have expanded, but essentially it's to help you create flyers, storyboards. It just goes on and on. It's great to start off. It saves you so much time because of the templates.
Excellent. So I do have a Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color specific question. I personally run a BIPOC-centered gallery space. We are free to use. We charge no commission. We take no gallery fees to show with us. But we have seen specific challenges facing Black and Indigenous and other persons of color. Could maybe you speak a little bit to some of those challenges and how to overcome those in the marketing realm?
Yeah, Yeah, okay, go ahead. I think one of the things is just understanding how much work it takes for some people to just show up. Right. We had an event, an Arts Hub event in Northampton a few weeks ago. And this one woman, a Black woman, she had to catch 2 buses, and it took her 2 hours to get there. With the car, it's like a 20-30 minute drive, right? A friend of mine who's a professor, he had a kid in his class who was always turning his assignments in late. And he was really angry, Black kid. And he says to him, you're going to fail. And show me what you're working on right now for this assignment. So this kid takes out his phone and he opens it and he says, yeah, but show me on your laptop. He says, I don't have a laptop. I type all my assignments on my phone.
Oh, wow.
So then he was like, oh, wow, on your phone? And this kid was doing 2 other jobs, right? So I think just understanding what it takes, the things that we take for granted, was like, yeah, just post on social media, right? Just, someone is thinking, oh, but I don't have the right sort of connection. So as a marketing practitioner working with artists, I need to think about that when I'm working with people, that, it's easy to get upset when you're working with an artist and they're just not giving you the stuff you're asking for. But understanding what it takes just to show up helps you meet them where they are.
I think this is like, we could have like a whole other webinar on this.
Yeah.
Because I do think obviously there's like different barriers that we face. I think that one of the main things too that I find a little frustrating is the fact that a lot of times, like for people of color, like a lot of times they find that audience members want, or I'll just specifically speak for like filmmaking, that they want specific stories that have to do with like our trauma. And not necessarily so much with joy or like happiness. And then there's also like another side of that too, just like when you're creating content, there's also this burden that you may feel with just like with things happening around the world, or maybe in your own community, that you feel like, I'm an artist, I need to be telling these stories, right? Instead of just doing like something more experimental. So I feel like I can speak for myself that I have struggled with those two different things. And I think it's just giving yourself always like giving yourself like the flexibility in terms of just like, if this is something that I want to create in terms of like sharing social justice based content and advocating for my community, then sure, because you have the tools to do so. But then also giving yourself the flexibility of being like, I'm also a human being, I'm also an artist as well, and I also deserve to produce any type of work within itself. And I would say too, for like a marketing perspective, is just using that to like, if there was any type of like moment to like highlight yourself or just like highlight your culture, your identity, I would say that this is the best time to do so now. And I think that we're very fortunate in this period of time, even though again, there is like a lot of different challenges, there's a lot of issues happening around the world now. I think that there's a lot of foundations, a lot of organizations, a lot of businesses that want to support artists. They might have different reasons behind it. They might not necessarily they might want to just like jump on like whatever's like trending right now. But I think it's just like we have to use that to our advantage. This is our moment to be creating stuff that is representing like our people, our communities, our identities. And don't shy away from your story, don't shy away from your culture, and just own it.
Fascinating. So we did just receive another question from the audience, and I want to really be able to honor the questions that are coming in. And this question is from Akali, Hernandez, and that is, what is the most interesting thing you've learned about marketing that you hadn't realized was a core element of marketing, parentheses, outside of networking and genuine connections?
I think we've been talking about it all evening. Marketing is service.
Well, someone at one point had told me, done is better than perfect. And so just stepping into the arena and getting something done oftentimes will be 10 times better than having it be perfect. But for artists particularly, you know, so much of our work is about crafting the perfect expression. And so could you give us any advice around how to get over that fear, how to get over those nerves?
Yeah, well, I just want to speak to that question a bit more before we move on
yeah, please.
to that. For me, the most interesting thing I've learned about marketing is how many people give up on their products, on their work, because no one is paying attention. And yet they haven't exposed that work to enough people to reach that conclusion that no one wants to pay attention. Right? So for instance, someone launches a book, they put a post on Facebook saying, hey, my book is out, no one buys, and think, oh, but no one is interested, right? So it's a marathon, right? Marketing is consistency. It's not just one event. It's a number of strategic, well-planned events that are all pushing towards one outcome. So that's been really interesting for me, coming from this perspective that I spoke about earlier, where as an artist growing up, you think, oh yeah, if the work is good, surely it will find an audience. And then realizing that no, there's just so much happening, so much noise. And if you want your work to find an audience, you have to do the work. You have to work for your art.
I'm feeling particularly called out right now by that. I appreciate it. I had a book come out last year, and you know, I think I put it on Facebook and Instagram once or twice, and then stopped. You know, it is kind of daunting when you're an artist and you're doing this work on your own to feel as though if you're not getting traction right away, does that mean your product's just not any good? But to hear that, no, it just takes a lot to cut through the noise gives me a lot of hope. So I want to talk about storytelling for a minute, because this came up a lot earlier in our conversation. But what role do you think that storytelling really plays in your art and connecting with buyers?
I mean, for me, it's number one. That's what, as a photographer and filmmaker, that is what I have really focused on. Even when I am working with nonprofits and small businesses, to me, I think it's just because of like my nature of just like that is what I specifically am interested in. And hence that's also like the content that I want to be producing for when I connect with like different clients or even artists themselves. I do feel like, again, some people shy away from that. They don't want to necessarily tell their story because they don't want to be vulnerable in that sense. But I do think it makes like a huge difference when you are like writing a caption or just like telling a story, like creating a reel. Like people do, especially since there's like this like lonely epidemic, I think now too, is just like people want to feel connected to you. Like you don't necessarily have to provide like all the full-blown details. But I would just like categorize it, and when you're producing content or just when you're producing marketing materials itself, like I would categorize like different sections of your story, because different people will resonate with different parts of your story.
I totally agree. And a critical part of storytelling and connecting with people is when you share the product, when you share the outcome, it's the success story, right? This is what I produced. But when you are sharing your story, you bring out, oh, this is what is not working. This is where I've failed. This is where I've struggled. And people connect with that so much more than, hey, this is my award-winning book, which, is on so many bestseller lists. And I highly recommend that, when people are thinking about, oh, I'm going to post, I'm going to market, that is part of you of what you're doing, talking about the things that are not working, talking about the everyday things, like like I couldn't do my work today because my kids were bouncing off the walls, things like that, right? People connect with that. There's someone I follow on Instagram, Jenna Kutcher, and she talks about when you've got a platform. So say you're on TikTok and social media, a lot of people just want to talk about the work. She says find four things. So there's your work, and think of three other things that you're going to talk about. So say you are design websites, maybe I like poetry, then I build Lego with my kids. Just find four things that you talk about, so it's not just the one thing. So there's your professional thing, but then add three other things that humanize you, things that you do that you love, that maybe some people talk about their love for Starbucks or whatever it is, right? Yeah.
That is so interesting, and I never thought about it that way. I actually had a TikTok post. Out of all the TikTok posts I created around being an artist and running the gallery, where I was complaining about having a tooth pain, and that was the one that took off for some reason.
Exactly.
It's so strange to actually hear that, though, packaged and given back to us, because it is so easy to forget that as an artist, we are people, and people want to connect with people, as you said earlier. But I guess that does open up the question of, finding a balance between being an artist and being a brand. And what kind of advice could you give us about finding that balance?
I want to suggest that if you are being open, honest, vulnerable, you're willing to connect, you don't have to think about your brand. Do you think about who you are when you walk into a party? All I'm looking to do is find the people I can connect with and have connection. If I'm thinking about how I'm projecting myself, I'm probably being pretty inauthentic. But if I'm being honest with who I actually am and talking about my toothache because that's bothering me today, I'm likely to find someone else who's having some kind of pain, and we can commiserate and we can connect. And I don't have to think about my brand. My brand is who I am authentically. It's your promise to those of how you help. Now that gets different because you're separating yourself from the marketing. And when I go out to market, I want to express how I help. And back to the earlier question, Michelle, I think you'll relate to this, is for years, people said, well, what do you do, Mitch? And I would say, I'm in branding. And they would look at me so blankly. And one woman said to me one day, she said, you got to give me a break. I grew up on a farm. And when I hear branding, here's what I think about. And so I don't use it anymore. And what I realize I do is I help people understand their story and then use that story as a tool for transformation. That's my brand. That's my promise of how I help, but it's not who I am. Who I am is, to your point, okay, like when my kids were young, I loved playing Legos. When my daughter, who's now 30, when I would come home from the office, she would say, want a Duplo. It was a way of connecting. So, I completely relate to what you're saying. It's a way for you and me to recognize we have some commonality.
Yeah. What you're saying, Mitch, it reminds me of something that someone said, which is the niche is you, right? There's this talk online about niching down, focusing. But if you think of, there's a woman in Northampton, May, who runs, she's a fitness instructor, and she has a gift shop, right? And one of the things when she was to think of when she was branding was, oh, do I focus on the fitness or the gift shop? Then she said, but all of these things are me. So she does both, and she does a great job of it. And so I think adding on to what Mitch has said, it's what you do, how you do it is your brand. But for an online audience, I think you need to decide, okay, there's just so many sides to me. Which sides am I going to show? And which ones I'm just not going to put out there because it'll just confuse people.
And I think you mentioned that earlier, Michelle, about categorizing and compartmentalizing the different aspects of who you are and what you do, and sharing those compartments. We have about 10 minutes left, and again, I want to honor the questions that are coming in. So we did just receive a question from the audience asking, what's your most successful campaign that you've run? And so let's hear about some successes.
I'll talk about one, which was the most surprising campaign, and it ties in with community. It was a friend of mine that I helped launch a book. The first person I ever helped launch a book. She wanted to launch this book, a poetry collection, the first collection, and she didn't have a budget for it. And I said to her, okay, you are very active in the community. What do we need? Let's put a plan together. We need someone to do a poster. We need someone to MC on the night. And so we reached out to everyone we knew and put together a committee that would launch this book. So I helped her with her online marketing. Someone did posters. Someone, organized an event. And the book went on to win the award for the best first collection in Zimbabwe, in the country, and launched her career, if I can put it out, because she does something else in poetry as a part-time thing. So now she has a second book and has done really well for herself as a poet. So for me, just that the power of community coming together and working to help her launch the book was just, I was amazed at how well that worked.
What comes up for me when you ask that question is, I mentioned earlier the DIY brand camp that I developed about 15 years ago. That is easily the most powerful marketing tool I have ever done. Every client I have today came directly from that. If it did not come from that, it came from a referral from that. And I want to go back to generosity, because what I recognized when I did that workshop, I've worked for some very, very big brands, and I've worked internationally, and I've worked for brands who had tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of budget. And I recognized this was in 08, 09, the economy was in the toilet. My business was in the toilet. And I recognized, you know what? The people I really want to work with can't afford me. They can't afford the prices I charge. So let me give it away. And that's why I created the DIY brand camp. I gave it away. And it comes back to generosity. Today I have all the clients I want, and I can turn clients away because I gave it away first.
I think to go off of that, one of my, because like I mentioned before, I create photography and filmmaking. Those are the two services that I provide. And what resonated with me was with what Mitch was saying was just like figuring out who you really like want to be working with. And so most recently I worked with a foundation that essentially was kind of like one of my dream clients to be working with. And it worked because of that. It worked because I already had I had built a relationship with them beforehand. And I had and it was like a thing where I mentioned earlier, it was just like a collaborative process that I was feeling fulfilled like through that relationship, but they were also being fulfilled based off of like the services that I was providing them. And it was it was a beautiful thing because I think the relationship that we have is that they respect me, not just as a business, but as an artist myself. And so they gave me like the liberty to produce work and trust in me and to produce the work that I know how to produce. And so doing so, I was able to produce a short mini series promoting the artists in their programming. So It was one of the most recent relationships that I've had, and I felt rewarded because they're happy. The series is doing really well on their end and getting funding for their artists, and then I also felt fulfilled again with that relationship.
Thank you so much. And I have to say, I'm a huge fan of your work, by the way, just across the board. Feel like if I have a public space to say it, I'm going to say it.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. So we have about 5 minutes left. And in this last 5 minutes, I'd love to hear some marketing advice that you wish people knew. Just what is one thing you wish everyone knew?
Don't look at it as an obligation. Think of it as a joy. Think of it as a way to discover yourself.
And for me, there was a time when you had to guess what to do and how to do it when you're marketing a product or a project. Now, with the tools out there, you can see what other organizations are doing, right? How they're marketing their products and their art, and what keywords. So, for instance, with websites, what keywords are driving traffic to their websites, so that you know what sort of content to produce, and so you don't have to start with a blank page ever.
I would always say main thing for me is just to lean in on your story. And then the second thing would be don't be afraid to also tap in to your resources or to your network to also ask for help. Like, you don't have to do everything on your own.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I've heard tonight just the importance of community from all three of you. And I want to thank you for that message, because I think it's really important for artists to hear. Sometimes it is so isolating being an artist, and to hear how important it is, not just for your soul, but also for your practice. It's a good reminder. I also would like to give just the audience one more chance to ask questions. We have a couple minutes left. If there's any questions out there, please, now's the time. And if not, I would like to thank again each and every one of you for taking the time to be here this evening, and give you the opportunity to plug anything that you would like to plug. So plug away.
Self-promotion.
Yeah, self-promotion.
Everyone is like, oh, I hadn't prepared for this. What are we? Well, we spoke earlier on about websites, personal professional websites. I have a tool on my website that does a scan of your site, an audit, and tells you what you can fix, how you can optimize it so that you get more traffic to your site, and I can share the link in the chat.
Well, please do.
Yeah, and I would just say that again, you've heard me say this throughout the webinar, but love working with artists. If there's anyone that wants to collaborate together in building any photography or filmmaking services, feel free to hit me up. I believe that on the website or underneath the video, they'll have more information on my website and how to contact me.
And Mitch, do you have a plug for us?
Earlier, I did post a link to my own newsletter. I encourage you to read it. It is a labor of love for me. I do it because I call it my knitting. I knit disparate ideas together, hoping to create shawls of hope. That's what I do with that. And I would encourage you to read it and subscribe.
Wonderful. And I'm going to take this opportunity to once again plug Valley Arts Mentors. It's a great organization. I have been blessed to work with Jonathan to plug Holyoke Media. Holyoke Media is a wonderful resource in the city of Holyoke and beyond. Scott McPherson and his team are doing some incredible things. To plug Attack Bear Press, we are an arts organization that publishes poetry and does general arts nonsense. And finally, 50 Arrow Gallery. 50 Arrow Gallery is located in East Hampton. We encourage you to come on down. Now it's the moment of the night where I thank all of the funders for all of their incredible support of these webinar series that allows us to have these incredible conversations. So thank you to the Community Foundation of Western Mass Valley Creates program with funding from the Barr Foundation. Thank you to Mass Humanities. Thank you to Mass Cultural in general, but specifically thank you to the Chicopee, Conway, Hadley, Holyoke, Ludlow, Northampton, South Hadley, Springfield, and West Hampton Cultural Councils, local agencies which are supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a statewide agency. So thank you all so much. And if Jonathan, if you have any final words for us, we'd love to hear from Valley Arts Mentors.
Well, I'll do a quick plug for Valley Arts Mentors, which is, the webinar series is one very enjoyable part of what we do. But of course, the other almost primary part of what we do is we match early career artists with more experienced artists, and we're getting ready for the 2025 cohort. So if you know people who might benefit from a 6-month mentorship with a more experienced artist in your discipline, please check out the website or pass the website around. And I also want to thank, this was just so enjoyable for me. Thank you all for being here. And Jason, thank you for being I just love watching you moderate and have you, just take you're being given and jump from question to question. It's really been a pleasure. So thanks.
Well, I love my own voice. I am a shameless self-promoter.